We looked ahead to Election Day with the Washington-based reporter and presenter Julia Manchester, who works for the leading US political news website, The Hill. Julia, you have a show called What's America Thinking? So go on, tell us.
Yes. What is America thinking? Oh gosh, that's a good question. Oh, we'll find out tomorrow, I guess.
What's your feeling though? Because you've had the eve of poll messages in the last minute campaigning in the 7 target areas. So what have they been?
Look, we are seeing in all of these swing states, it is incredibly narrow. We saw that the New York Times Santa College poll, for example, was released earlier today, and it shows basically Harris leading in some swing states, Trump leading in the others. I believe it's dead even in Pennsylvania. But look, this is all within the margin of error. So it is very, very narrow. I think that a lot of the campaigns, how they're approaching this is that in a way, they're obviously competing with each other, but they're also competing with the couch. I mean, we see that every election is about turnout, but because this is so close, so narrow, it's going to matter just that much more this time. We've seen that there's a lack of enthusiasm in some corners of the Democratic coalition, so it's going to be important for Harris to get her base turned out. And, you know, we are seeing indications that there are parts of Harris's base, like independent women, for example, who are very much fired up.
But there's a decent turnout already. 17 million people have already voted.
17 million people have already voted, and we can expect to see even more turnout tomorrow on Election Day. It's interesting because 4 years ago, it was more so the Democrats that were pushing their base to come out and vote early. You saw former President Trump actually spreading a lot of unfounded conspiracy theories about the election in terms of early voting and mail-in voting. That has been completely turned on its head. Now you have Trump encouraging his voters and his base supporters to go out and vote. So that's what kind of makes it up in the air. We don't really know who it's necessarily going to benefit.
Given that it seems so evenly divided, it's also deeply divided. How did America get to be so deeply divided, so polarized as an electorate?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. Look, we've seen congressional districts, for example, that have become much more homogeneous. You see fewer and fewer swing districts, for example. You have obviously partisan media playing a huge role in all of this. And you also have I think, a shifting of, you have a shift in political rhetoric, for example. We've seen there's been an increase in populism on the left and the right really over the past 8 years. And I think that's being reflected. And you see it reflected particularly right now within the Republican Party, where you have Donald Trump putting out this populist message that's so appealing to a lot of base Republican voters.
But I mean, it has felt, from looking at it from this far away, very nasty, a very angry campaign with, really, really quite terrible political language used on both sides.
Yes, and you have to remember, this is 4 years after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. You have 2 assassination attempts that have been against former President Trump this cycle. So you have it just increasingly becoming nasty, and I think it's turned a lot of Americans off to this idea of participating and paying attention to this election. I think a lot of Americans want this to be over. They're looking forward to it ending. But, as we saw in 2021, it doesn't necessarily end with the election. So I think there's a lot of anxiety right now among Americans. And I think we can expect that anxiety to continue regardless of who wins going into December and January.
So what have been the big issues for the candidates then?
So the big issues, I would say, on the Democratic side, obviously abortion access and reproductive health care. This is the first presidential election since the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022. And we've seen Democrats historically, since 2 years ago, be successful on campaigning on this issue. In fact, in 2022, during the midterm elections, you saw Republicans focusing on issues like the economy, crime, and immigration. But in a number of states across the country, most states across the country, with the exception of Florida, which saw a red wave, you saw Democrats largely, overperform while Republicans underperformed. So that's a big issue on their side. For Republicans, it continues to be the economy immigration, crime. You're going to hear Donald Trump talking about the economy. He oftentimes opens up his rallies with the line, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" Pointing to the fact that when he was president, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, inflation was lower, and there were some economic indicators that would suggest that the economy was stronger. So expect to hear that really in the candidates' closing messages.
One of the big points for Kamala Harris seems to be that she's neither Trump nor Biden. But people here, I think a lot of people here certainly find it difficult to see what the attraction of Trump is.
I think there's obviously a lot of Americans that feel that way as well, but it goes down to the fact that people are voting on policy oftentimes, particularly these swing independent voters. When Donald Trump asks that question, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" That's sort of a signal for voters to look at their pocketbooks and look at their financial situation. So they're not necessarily voting for Donald Trump, but they're voting for his policies. They're holding their nose and voting. And look, we've seen Donald Trump over the past few days, and this has gone back and forth throughout this election cycle, but over the past few days, his rhetoric has certainly become more inflammatory, more agitated, and that creates negative headlines for him. So I don't think he does himself any favors, but at the same time, look, we saw that was the case in 2016 and he still won, so it could really go either way.
Finally, how do you think it is going to go? Which way is it going to go?
We really don't know at this point. I mean, I was chatting with a Republican strategist who said he was cautiously optimistic today, but at the same time, you have a lot of Democrats saying they feel that with some recent polling that came out over the weekend, they feel that Kamala Harris, has the momentum at her back. So it's going to be very, very narrow. I would encourage your viewers, if they're following along, to keep track of the 7 key swing states here in the U.S., Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Those are the states that will decide the election.
Okay. Julia, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.